I'd like to show you a beautiful ending. This is Miles Andersson, 1981, and it's white to move. And I'll just talk for a little bit, and you can think about what you think about the position, what white might do while I speak. Now, one of the interesting things about chess is the transformation of advantages. So, for example, you can think of chess as a three-dimensional game where you have material, which is kind of easy to understand, time, which is not so easy, but usually we're just talking about time to move, tempo, and quality of position as the third dimension. Very difficult to understand because there's so many different qualities that we can talk about. Okay, and the transformation of advantage is turning one kind of advantage into another. And while you're thinking, I'm going to speak about this game as if it were a poem or a piece of music, and I'm going to sing something terrible here. And it's just going to go like this. Dun, 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 dun. Sounds kind of ugly. Now, your first impression of this position might also be that it's actually kind of ugly. And a lot of people's first reaction to this is that there's not much going on. In fact, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And the four notes that I sung to you just then are the beginning of from which he's going to transform those four notes into a whole beautiful symphony. Now, I'm going to use this symphony as an example because it's oftentimes hard to understand what we mean by transformation of advantage and the idea that you can take a basis of musical notes, a little phrase, and turn it into something bigger. And that's something that we're going to see in this game. So, white begins, very simple move, bishop d2. And I've shown this game to a lot of different players of differing levels. And, you know, because they know that I'm setting it up to be a big, interesting game, they are often inclined not to do bishop d2 because they think that something crazy should happen. But bishop d2 is definitely correct. And let's talk about what's going on in the position. The biggest feature is simply that white is up 2 tempi. Right? And we can characterize that as saying black owes us a move and that we've got this guy out. It's that simple, right? Now, the first thing that we should say about what these tempi do is that it's going to make it difficult for the black king to stay in the center of the board. Now, generally, we would like to keep the king in the center of the board just so they can do stuff. And if it goes to the side of the board and castles, then the problem will be that it kind of then owes us time because it's going to owe us some time to get back, to march back to the center of the board. So with bishop d2, for example, it will become difficult for the king to play a move like king e7 because then it could come under attack with something like knight e4 and bishop b4. Okay, so black castles, rook c1, makes sense. And now bishop d7. Now, when you look at this position, it probably should feel that black has a very defensible, tough structure. And what he's doing with bishop d7 is what we call in German eine Tauschmaschine, an exchanging machine with bishop c6. And not only is he going to fix his poor bishop, but he's going to exchange our beautiful bishop on g2. So then the question becomes, well, what should we do about it? And this next move will seem really simple, but it's actually, I feel, kind of paradoxical. It took me a while to understand how beautiful it was. And it's simply castles, and you can say, cry, what are you talking about, buddy? It's just a simple move. But we don't really want to castle. And the point of castling is after bishop c6, we don't have to do anything about the bishop. It doesn't have a threat anymore, so it can exchange itself off. But if we had to take the bishop on c6 in order to preserve our tempo, we would invite the knight back into the game. We don't want to do it. Okay, So here's a question you ask yourself: what should white do? And no one gets this one right, even though it's, so when you see it, you'll probably think it's obvious. So you can ask yourself, what should white do? And the answer is rook c2. It's a beautiful multi-purpose move, which does at least three things. One, it prepares to double, very important. Two, it controls b2 so that when our knight moves, we don't lose a pawn. And three, which is less obvious, later in the game we'll see it's nice that the rook is actually covering this square, because then our opponent's rook will not enter. And that's obviously a little bit hard to imagine right now, but we'll see it as actually a third feature of the move rook c2. And from an aesthetic perspective, I want to say that the most beautiful moves in chess are often moves with more than one idea, and we're going to see a couple of those in this ending. All right, so black takes. Notice our king got a tempo closer to the middle of the board. Knight c6, the knight's got to come in, and now knight e4. Our knight is a strong piece. Rook f d8, makes sense. And now what I will say is a humble move, bishop c3. And what's nice about this move is it needs to be done because the bishop on g7 is black's best piece. And it is a concession to black that we're going to take the thing and bring the king closer to the center. But still, it's got to go. Our bishop on d2 was a target for the rook on d8, and his bishop on g7 definitely his best piece. So we're going to get rid of it. Rook fc1. And here's probably a good time to just take stock of some of the transformations that have happened. For one, we can say that in terms of time, you can argue it's roughly equal, but our rooks, the white rooks, are much stronger than their counterparts, much more effective, and are threatening things maybe like b4, b5. And the knight on c6 is having trouble moving. In fact, from a perspective from white, we really kind of liked the knight to move so that we could get all the way down to the 7th rank. Also, we can start comparing pieces and say that our knight is just a little bit better than the black knight. And when we talk about quality of position, that's generally what we're talking about, just comparing pieces in the ending. And so this forces black to play a kind of sad-looking passive move, rook b8, because white was threatening b4. Okay, and so one of the features of this ending is that our pressure will force concessions from our opponent, and those concessions will make his pieces worse, such as rook b8, having to leave the c-file. Okay, what should white do? Now a nice multi-purpose move, a3. Two things that it does. Yes, it prepares b4, but also it's just a useful thing to take away squares from this knight, to defang it, and we've already covered this square, and now we've got this one. All right, here we go. a5, stopping b4, but definitely a concession, because now there's weaknesses in the camp over here. All right, ask yourself, what should white do? No one gets this right. Rook c3 was the move. And it's just really beautiful, very slow and simple. Now with rook b3, intending things like knight c5 and maybe an occupation either at b5 or b6 with the rook. Very simple and strong. Now, black needs to do something or else the pressure is just going to grow. And one metaphor that I like from wrestling, I was a terrible wrestler, but this is what I learned from it, is that when you are on top of your opponent and they're just kind of sitting there, there's not a lot you can do. It's kind of hard to move them. But when they try to stand up, that's when they're at their most vulnerable, because that's when their balance is going to be shaky. And this happens all the time in chess when someone tries to break out of their bad position. So here we come, and one of the differences, beautiful differences between chess and something like music is in music, there's just one author who is in control. But in chess, we can't control everything. We have to react to our opponent, and when we're transforming an advantage, we have to take whatever our opponent can give us. So here we go, and Miles plays f5, transforming really the nature of the position. Now there's going to be a weakness on e6, and the knight is going to be encouraged to come to c5. And when it goes to c5, black will have this opportunity to maybe penetrate to d2. Knight c5, rook d6. Now, some commentators have felt that maybe here black should have played king f6. And this is definitely a thought, but one thing I realized was after rook b3, rook d2, which would be, I guess, the intention, is instead of taking on something like b7, where black might get some counterplay, I found this move to be very vicious and cruel. The rook can't do anything in terms of counterplay all on its own, and the knight is just tied because we'll win this beautiful pawn if black moves the knight. And furthermore, this guy has a hard time moving too. So very difficult position. Now, by the way, a serious question could be asked like, well, Jesse, do you think the position's winning for white from the very beginning? The answer is, I don't know. Maybe it's winning, but it's at the very least those two tempi that we begin with, that we're transforming the position to various kinds of advantages here. It's an unpleasant position for black. Okay, so black in the game played rook d6, rook b3, b5. Okay, now let's state the obvious. The advantage of b5 is that the knight, which was the guardian of the c file, penetration of the c file, has now lost its support, right? And ask yourself, what should white do? Well, we got rook d3. It seems so obvious and simple, but the point is the rook did its job. We now trade this guy off. And by the way, maybe just show a quick tactic here. If rook d8, there's maybe more than one thing, but this would be very unpleasant right here. Okay, so rook d3, snip snop, rook b6, and let's state the obvious. We've now kind of transformed it again. The rook on b6 is dramatically weaker than the rook on c1. f4, king f6. And here a move I like a lot from white, though it's debatable. Now, some people have suggested that maybe white should play rook c5 to completely stop e5. And by all means, white is better there. But I like white's move a lot. Just king f3. We will allow black to play e5. We'll even allow him to trade the knights. But we will retain the better rook. And when we play king f3, we're gaining time. The king needs to go up. Now we get this trade, check to the miserable king, king d6, and now b4. And here we have it. And one thing I really want to stress about the beauty of this ending is that the advantage of the two tempi has truly been transformed from the beginning to now much later, where we're dealing with a passive rook on b6 and the potential now for our king to become much more active. And one thing I want to stress about this is the fact that our rook is more active on c5 means that really, if black just wants to sit, the rook will also be active on the king side whilst we try to do something over here, and black has to sit over there on the queen side, passively guarding the b5 pawn. Now, what should black do? He could take and just suffer. Or, as in the game, it goes like this. Rook b7, h4, a4. And AB would just lead to a position where black is completely passive. And maybe he could someday just sack the pawn on b5. Probably that's what you would have to end up doing, because the white king is going to advance. Or you can play like Miles did and say to yourself, eventually my rook will hopefully penetrate into white's camp and I'll have to give up the b5 pawn, but I'll get the a3 pawn and maybe I'll get a little counterplay. Okay, king f4, king e6, h5, king f6, check, king f7, and now Andersson does the KGB maneuver to black, rook c5. What I mean by the KGB is these Soviets, they learned that if you repeat on opponent, it's very unpleasant. And there's probably a whole psychological dissertation you could do on this subject. But just from my own practical experience, I will say that it feels like you're just being toyed with, i.e. the guy's just saying, you know, I'm in control of this game, buddy. And I'm just going to show it to you by doing this. And that's what I call the KGB. So here we go, as he gets the KGB on him. And what does black do? Now black jerks, as the Soviets say. He jerks in the positioning and goes for this immediate counterplay. Now, people have suggested that black should have done something like this. And all I can say is, in my understanding, we do something like this kind of business, it's still a lot of pain. There's still a lot of pain left in this position. So let's continue with the game. Check to the miserable king, snip, g5, king f3, rook takes. White is up 2 pawns. He keeps the a pawn in check, and now what we can say is we've transformed the advantage in time, the extra 2 tempi from the beginning of the game, to now an advantage in material, the first dimension of the game. And now really white is going to make it look a little bit easy. Don't fall for mate, by the way, with something like this. This would not be good. Don't fall for that. Check to the miserable king instead. Trade it off. And Andersson is a master at this kind of ending. And here, black doesn't have much, and he simply is going to resign. So there are several end games like this that Ulf played. I like this one a lot because it starts with these ugly notes and then gets transformed into these various phases, different kinds of advantage. I hope you enjoyed it too. Bye-bye.